Greetings, everyone. I hope you can hear me. Hope everybody had a happy Thanksgiving. Rabbi David is going to be a bit late today, so let's give it another minute, and then I will actually, here he comes. All right.
Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening.
Good afternoon.
Okay, I just got off an excellent presentation that I organized last minute for once a month in the slot before our study group. There's a group of progressive Zionist members of the Rabbinical Assembly, that is the conservative movement, where these things up maybe even 5 years ago, we weren't allowed to say out loud. I mean, I did, and I got into trouble, but you weren't allowed to talk about being a progressive Zionist. And now there's a special group devoted to it that I help organize, and had a speaker present, his analysis of the recent elections and we can talk about that at some time as well. I think I probably mentioned in the past, these are difficult times. Really in the state of Israel for so many different things, but more than everything else because of the Palestinian issue and human rights. There's also question of religious rights. As non-Orthodox rabbis, our work will be highly curtailed, as will non-Orthodox synagogues and youth groups. So we're looking towards we're looking to a difficult time. And I've been asked a lot by people in the progressive world, so what kind of hope do you have? Well, I always have hope. We're people of faith, and we have hope that things will get better, whether it's in the end of days or whether it's in tomorrow. But my hope is that since Bibi Netanyahu has been so dishonest in the past and remains an extremely dishonest person, that he won't honor any of the agreements, or he'll honor very little of the agreements he's making right now, which will lead eventually probably to a different kind of coalition. If indeed he is let off the hook, which I don't think he should be, but that might be the lesser of evils from a judicial point of view, and all of his personal issues that he's being tried for after being indicted, then this coalition, this horrible coalition with some really evil people in it, will fall apart, and it'll be more of a centrist coalition, which I never thought I would ever say. But it's not a time to be right. It's a time to think about how things might work. That's my own take on it. So,
wow, David, what's the relationship between progressive Zionist and more conservative in terms of the ratio? Would you say? Is it?
Yeah. So first of all, just a note on the usage of the word conservative. I think all of you know my views in so many different ways. I am anything but a conservative person, right? But I am a conservative rabbi. I'm a big C conservative rabbi. I'm part of the conservative movement that I was ordained in. I've always been pushing to the edge, the liberal progressive edge of the conservative movement, but I'm still a dues-paying member of that organization. The history of that is that the word conservative was used in relationship to the reform movement of the 19th century, where some of the rabbis said, you guys are going too far, we're going to be a little bit more conservative. And yet there was still Orthodox, which was much more conservative to the right of that. Confusing stuff. But amongst my colleagues, and I don't even know how many, I used to think there's about 1,000 conservative rabbis around the world. There's probably more. My guess would be 20 to 25% are progressive, whereas 20-25% are seriously conservative and don't believe in a Palestinian state. There are those, and the majority are in the middle and cannot speak on this issue. I can speak on this, as my friends in Or Hamidbar know, because I founded an organization myself, and I'm not beholden to a board of directors, of which there's always inevitably going to be somebody who's more right-wing than I am, either in Israel politics or American politics. And because I can speak freely, I'm in a different situation. A lot of the colleagues that are in this group that come together once a month, they are unable to speak freely in their own congregations, and some of them are in other kinds of work as well, campus rabbis, and they have to be perceived as being far in the middle of the road. So that's all I can say as far as the conservative movement is concerned. Non-rabbis, there tends to be far more liberal. They're almost the vast majority vote Democratic in this country, and would side with the more liberal parties, or the more the center to center left to center to left parties in the state of Israel. And I would guess that would be 80%. It's just the rabbis tend to be a little more conservative.
And when you say there's elements within the coalition currently that are evil, what constitutes that? Why do you say that?
Evil. If you care to Google, and I don't use this term
Right.
liberally. Evil is when somebody has absolute disregard for human rights. Itamar Ben-Gvir, who, if the coalition agreements come through and they're honored, he will not be the head of the defense ministry, but he'll head a new ministry or a new department of the ministry which will head the police force, especially in the territories. If you Google Ben-Gvir in the last few days, you'll see an incident that happened where some progressive activists were disrespected by the soldiers. They were bullied by the soldiers, and he came out in defense of these soldiers against the officers who actually punished the soldiers for roughing up some leftist activists. But his views are well known. He's a disciple of Meir Kahane, who was an absolute racist, who was assassinated eventually, but was who moved to Israel in the 70s and formed a party which was banned. A few years later, was banned by law. The Knesset itself made a law to ban Kahane's party, and now a would-be member of that party is going to be in a ministerial position. Another one of the people who are part of the coalition who has just been given responsibilities for all of conversion and Jewish identity programs in Israel is a open homophobe who claims that homosexuality is destroying the state of Israel. The member Smotrich, the head of the religious Zionist party, has continuously derided anybody who's in favor of full rights for Palestinians, or full rights for these anti-feminists, these homophobic. These are people that have gone on record proudly stating these things. That's why I call them evil, Steve.
Mm-hmm.
It's not just a difference of politics. I can understand somebody from the Likud, from the right wing, one of the right wing parties, saying, "Listen, we cannot trust the Palestinians, therefore we can't give them a state." I don't agree with that, but I can understand. I don't call that evil. I call that realpolitik, right? I don't even call evil people that are against different aspects of LGBTQ advocacy. Not everybody. My folks will say it's rare that I'll call anybody evil, but sometimes policies are evil. Banning. I don't think I ever referred to the former president as being evil, but banning immigrants from Muslim states was an evil policy. I didn't say the word evil then, but it was so I guess that's my reaction to self-confessed or even proud hatred from someone else. I will share with you, I may have shared with you before, there was something that happened to me personally a few years ago, and I was talking with one of my colleagues here, my good friend, Rev Kev, who's a UCC minister, and he himself had been terribly mistreated by the Methodist Church. He was ordained Methodist and had to leave when he came out of the closet, had to leave his pulpit in Wisconsin, and years ago. And in any case, I was complaining about these people, and he says, "Now, David, as our tradition teaches us, turn the other cheek." I said, No. That's your tradition. My tradition is, if we need to take revenge, we take revenge, right? Your tradition is to turn the other cheek. And I say that, in a cheeky way. Okay.
Nice. Thank you.
Should we get to our study? I'm sorry for that outburst there, political. I hope I didn't make anybody uncomfortable. But and of course,
well, we do know that historically, when evil policies gain powerful proponents who have political power, then genocide can happen, and it does happen.
Mm.
And so I think that is an equal impulse. And that's kind of where I hear you coming from.
Yeah. Can I also add something? I think the labels of liberalism and conservatism just don't apply. I mean, they're too narrow because I see so many liberals here in America that I think of them as anti-Semitic. I mean, literally. And so to say that we are liberal or we are conservative, it's just not, doesn't do the job, doesn't, completely define us. So to say I'm a liberal or a conservative is kind of limiting, I think, still.
I agree, Ajit, and because one word definitions are never really good, are they? Right? We need to see the nuance in it as well, right? And I of course am against anti-Semitism of any kind. I want to understand where it's coming from in order to constantly check myself. Have I, as a Jew, done something or support something which would create that kind of animosity in someone, whoever that someone is, right? And so what we're dealing with in this study group here is what is the place of the book of Acts in particular that has possibly created some of that animosity amongst Christian folk, scripture reading folk, right? And you as a Baha'i and us as Jews, we're looking at it in a slightly different way, but we want to try to understand it. In the same way, I remember coming here I got here in 2015. And that's when the shit hit the fan, right? That's when the political situation, who would have believed? And I remember saying to somebody, I want to talk to somebody who supports Trump. I want to try to understand where they're coming from. That doesn't mean to agree. So I agree with you, Ajit, to call somebody specifically, in that particular camp or MAGA or whatever it might be, is not entirely helpful, right? And especially when it comes to personal relationships, because we know so many people who have particular supporters of particular political policy or party, and yet they have loved ones who are LGBTQ. They have loved ones who have needed an abortion. They have loved ones, and it goes in the other direction as well. So we have to be really careful of labels. I agree. Thanks. Boy, I think I'm sermonizing a little bit too much this morning as well. So I will just say that we missed last week because of Thanksgiving, but we met 2 weeks ago when I was already in Denver. The conference hadn't started yet, and I feel so enriched by what I learned. Unfortunately, and this is the big unfortunately, the session that I wanted to go to the most, which discussed our issues and acts that have come up, especially poverty and things like that, or chosen poverty and socialist kind of ideas, things that have come up in Acts, that session was full. There was only room on the floor. And so I figured, I'm young, I could sit down on the floor. That lasted about 15 minutes. I just couldn't do it. I couldn't sit on the floor, my tuchus, my back. And so I missed, that was the most exciting session that it was on. There's always something else going on, but I hope to share with you folks some of the things that I've gained since then. Yeah. Okay. Shall we get to our text for today?
Let's do it.
Okay. So who's going to read? Terry, would you like to lead off today and read the first paragraph?
Sure. All right. So we are in Acts 14, continued success, opposition, and confusion. Paul and Barnabas in Iconium. The same thing occurred in Iconium, where Paul and Barnabas went into the Jewish synagogue and spoke in such a way that a great number of both Jews and Greeks became believers. But the unbelieving Jews stirred up the Gentiles and poisoned their minds against the brothers. So they remained for a long time speaking boldly for the Lord, who testified to the word of his grace by granting signs and wonders to be done through them. But the residents of the city were divided. Some sided with the Jews and some with the apostles. And when an attempt was made by both Gentiles and Jews with their rulers to mistreat them and to stone them, the apostles learned of it and fled to Lystra and Derbe, cities of Lycaonia, and to the surrounding region, and there they continued proclaiming the good news.
my question for reactions would be, how, not so much looking at Acts as a historical account, but as a literary work. What is this episode? Has it added anything? Is it just going over stuff? Is it the same old, same old? Any reactions to, has something new come to your mind reading this paragraph?
Best I can think of is that it is introducing us to some of the early Christian leadership, people that we would not normally know.
Right, so you're talking about communities as opposed to names of people, right? Yeah.
Correct.
And I would add perhaps different geographical locations. I have a map here, but it's so small. I have this that we should get a map at some point, just get a feeling for it. Maybe Steve, I'll leave that for you perhaps this time or next time to find a good map that would allow us to understand the scope, the globalization that's happening now. Anything else?
Well, there's a pattern. Oh, I'm sorry, Steve, go ahead.
Well, I just wanted to ask a question. It says that in a way that both Jews and Greeks became believers. Well, if the Greeks were in the synagogue, weren't they Jewish?
I'll let you answer that, Steve.
Well, yeah, I think some were, right? The so-called God-fearers, the Fubemenoi, those uncircumcised Gentiles who nonetheless loved the Jewish ethic and community and wanted to be part, but didn't want to become Jewish per se. But as we will soon see in this next section, it's out of the synagogue, and it's really a Greco-Roman pagan audience, if you will. And so it's a little more Gentiles, fully outside of the synagogue. But I think it's a mixed bag. And I would also just add that keep in mind, by the time this version that we're reading, the final version of the Lucan community that gives us this text, the temple in Jerusalem is destroyed. There's a burgeoning rabbinic revival on the Mediterranean coast. Probably right around this time, the tensions are so great between the traditional Jews and the Jewish Christians who are now suggesting Jesus is Messiah, even the idea of Jesus as divine, incarnate, divine. All of this is stirring things up. And when you consider the fact that the Romans gave permission to the circumcised Jews to practice their faith as they do, suddenly when that line becomes blurred and now you have uncircumcised folks and Gentiles part of this Jewish Christian community, then it dilutes that exemption. And so suddenly the Romans it becomes a political issue. And Claudius is the emperor during this period. He followed Caligula. Nero follows Claudius. So we're talking about 46 to 49 CE. But this reflection on that historical time that this story is set is much later, 90, 80, 90. And keep in mind, the consternation and the political and religious and cultural turmoil is really boiling up. And so much so that the Jewish community that was rooted in their traditions start to put a curse on the Gentile Christians and expel them from the synagogue. So what we're seeing acted out in these stories is the expulsion from the synagogue that became a policy, around 90, if not already in place. It's coming in the next decade. So that's all I would add.
Yeah, I want to counter that perhaps, because my knowledge is not nearly as vast as yours, Steve, is that this story reflects that blurring of boundaries, and that blurring of boundaries perhaps lingered on for longer than scholars used to think, maybe into the 2nd century. And but for me, from a literary point of view, this is a paragraph, this is a pericope about that blurring of boundaries. So your question is spot on, Steve, in that what were non-Jews doing in the synagogue? Things were not so blurred. You didn't have to have a membership card to get into the synagogue. I'll just share something. Fast forward to our times when I was the rabbi of Stockholm, the great synagogue, which had seats for 950 people, a really cathedral kind of structure. It was full to the brim 3 times a year, as expected, perhaps on Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, and there were actually 2 services. They were both full, but that's it. But not on Rosh Hashanah, not on the Jewish New Year. And the other day, also as expected, if you know anything about the Jewish community of Stockholm, was Holocaust Remembrance Day, which for Europe falls in January. And when I came there thought to be there began to be a 3rd time when it was filled, and when it was filled with Jewish, in this 3rd case, it was for Gay Pride Shabbat celebrations. It was absolutely full, and I would say over half of the people, the majority of the people, were non-Jewish people. Same thing for the Holocaust Memorial Day as well. Many of the people came. What I'm trying to say is that just like today in liberal, in liberal societies, a synagogue or a church can be used for other things. Many people would come because they heard there was a charismatic speaker. I think that's what I want to say. They heard there was a great speaker, charismatic. And at least the story is telling you, well, see, it was the typical population of the synagogue was growing, was bursting outwards because with people who were non-Jewish coming inside. To me, that's what this paragraph says. Whether that's a correct reading or not, I don't know. Okay. And of course, there's this introduction, I think, of violence, right? Did we have before stoning involved? Was there a threat of being stoned beforehand? I don't remember. But to me, that sticks out here. The things are getting hotter. They're getting more violent, perhaps as well. We'll see even more violent than this. And then finally, there is a different kind of. We're leading up to a different kind of contact with the pagan world, as we're going to see in just a moment. Okay? Anything else before we go on? So, Jim, you want to read the next section for us?
Paul and Barnabas in Lystra and Derbe, I'm pronouncing it correctly. In Lystra, there was a man sitting who could not use his feet and had never walked, for he had been lame from birth. He listened to Paul as he was speaking, and Paul, looking at him intently and seeing that he had faith to be healed, said in a loud voice, "Stand upright on your feet." And the man sprang up and began to walk. When the crowd saw what Paul had done, they shouted in the Lycaonian language, "The gods have come down to us in human form." Barnabas they called Zeus, and Paul they called Hermes, because he was the chief speaker. The priest of Zeus, whose temple was just outside the city, brought oxen and garlands to the gates. He and the crowds waited to offer sacrifice, wanted to offer sacrifice. When the apostles Barnabas and Paul heard of it, they tore their clothes and rushed out into the crowd, shouting, "People, why are you doing this? We are mortals just like you, and we bring you good news that you should turn from these worthless things to the living God, who made the heaven and the earth and the sea and all that is in them. In past generations, he allowed all peoples to follow their own ways, yet he had not left himself without a witness in doing good, giving you rains from heaven in fruitful seasons, and filling you with food and your hearts with joy." Even with these words, they were scarcely restrained. They scarcely restrained the crowds from offering sacrifice to them. But Jews came there from Antioch and Iconium and won over the crowds. Then they stoned Paul and dragged him out of the city, supposing that he was dead. But when the disciples surrounded him, he got up and went into the city. The next day, he went on with Barnabas to Derbe.
Okay, so many
I,
things.
I have a comment first.
Please.
Yeah, I know, there's a lot, but that when Paul was looked at the man and said, stand upright on your feet, that what struck me about that is the other times the apostles spoke and did healings, they always say, in the name of Jesus Christ, or, you know, invoking the power of Jesus' name or somehow. So for Paul to just stand himself and just say, you know, stand upright on your feet, I can see why they would think, well, he's a God. He's the where the power is coming from.
And perhaps the author also wanted us to see he's I don't mean it disrespectfully, but he is more godlike, more powerful than the other apostles, perhaps.
Could be. And, you know, maybe it's a bad translation or something. I don't know. But that struck me when I read it.
The go-to solution for tension in the text. It might be a bad translation.
Terry, the
Yeah.
stand upright on your feet, it's the same language used in Ezekiel chapter 2, verse 1 about the prophet. And so I don't know. I think for a first century Jewish reader, that would come out. So again, all these layers of biblical stories woven in.
I agree. I think this is an attempt to build Paul up. This really is an attempt to make Paul stand out amongst his fellow apostles. I think over time, Paul has become bigger than any of the other apostles, and this is Luke's attempt to start doing that, I think.
That seems right. And Ajit, in verse 3 up above, when it says they remained for a long time speaking boldly for the Lord, who testified to the word of his grace by granting signs and wonders to be done through them. That's the same word for word used in Acts chapter 5, verse 12 about the apostles. So this is definitely an elevation of Paul into that status at the least.
You know, I something stands out a little differently to me on that, because before all of that about Paul, he's talking about the guy, and he says he saw that he had the faith to be healed, and the emphasis is on that person's faith to be healed, and it doesn't say faith in what or anything like that, but he saw something different in that guy, and that's what seemed to stand out to me, was that guy's with the bad feet's faith and hope to be healed is what, I don't know, that's where I saw it. I didn't see that such an elevation of Paul. I saw it the faith of that person.
Just a couple of comments in response to yours. Reminds me of the woman who was hemorrhaging, who touched Jesus' robe. And he said, you know, your faith has made you well. It doesn't say faith in what per se, but implies that it's her faith, not him necessarily, I think. The second thought I had is down in verse 19 and 20, when Paul was supposedly dead, but the disciples surrounded him, and then he got up. He was healed from being supposedly dead. So I kind of read that the disciples surrounding him sort of delivered some kind of power that then sort of healed him or raised him from death, if you will. It's kind of sort of similar to when we lay hands on somebody and invoke healing to them or whatever.
I think what might be helpful for all of us in this conversation, if we have time today, is perhaps to read the parallel stories from Luke. One is the Acts story that in Acts 3, which on the second page, and the other one is from Luke 5. And especially in Luke 5, I see there is the idea also, which is about Jesus. There's the idea of when Jesus saw that they had faith. So people coming forward, there's this idea of seeing first. And so to my mind, this story does want to, I would say does want to put Paul aside a little bit and to make him a little bit more or a lot more like Jesus. But we could probably do that best if we read the passages, maybe when we finish our main section, if we have time. If not, then on our own we can look at these two passages, parallel passages. Okay.
I do think the Ovid passage on the back, David, just gives us a context for this Greco-Roman pagan audience, if you will, who Paul describes as being in the throes of idolatry. And he says something similar. Why don't you turn away from these lifeless things to the living God? It reminds me of what we're going to see in Acts chapter 17 when Paul is in Athens. It's the same kind of appeal to turn from that worldview that saw the gods, the Olympian gods, and the Roman gods that were kind of always behind the scenes and influencing our own will and our decisions. And it's also spoken of in the great chain of being, these diamonds, these intermediaries who influence inwardly or spiritually what we do on the surface of things. And as a result, their world was peopled with all kinds of forces that had to be placated or acknowledged to further their well-being. And so this is an instance where Paul addresses that worldview, that outlook, and suggests that these gods in the great chain of being are actually not determining your life as you think, and you're invited into a living relationship with the living God to be a partner. And so I think this is a dramatic text for revealing that piece of the culture.
Yeah, absolutely, and a surprising text. I wasn't expecting to see this in the Book of Acts, this reaction and this this confrontation, or as I put in this confusion of the people. It reminded me of the Naaman story that we had to look at another time about the Naaman in 2 Kings 5, who has a scaly skin disease, and there's this talk about how he's going to be cured, and when he is cured finally, he wants to take some earth from the land of Israel, some earth with him back to where he lives, so that he can worship Adonai, Elohei Yisrael, Adonai, the Lord of the land of Israel, right? He totally misunderstands. It just phenomenologically, it's a misunderstanding of where the healing came from, where things come from. In the background of this also is, at least from the 2nd century BCE, from the book of Daniel, and probably before that, but really only coming to surface in the book of Daniel, is the angelology, right? What are the other beings that are up there in God's world that are between our world and their world, and what is the interaction? And that's an ongoing, even to this very day, it's an ongoing debate in both of our faiths, right? What else is at play here other than God and a human relationship directly with God? And the last thing I'll say is that there's a tradition in the Talmud that says, the phrase is Ein Mazal Yisrael. There is no, and I'm just going to say it in Hebrew, there's no mazel to Israel. Now, mazel you may know from the term mazel tov, which everybody understands as being congratulations, but what it really means, mazal tov, is may you have a good fortune or good fate. The mazalot are the horoscope, are the stars, and that, even though we would think that would be contradictory to Jewish practice, many of you know that mosaic floors of in the land of Israel, the 4th, 5th, 6th centuries have horoscopes in them. They have Helios, the sun god, on it. There's that overlapping of worlds. It was never, the boundaries are blurred. And when the rabbis later on say that Israel is not governed by the fates, meaning that you could live your life and the stars, they will govern your life, but you as a Jew, they're being very particularistic here, you a Jew, if you keep the Torah and the commandments, then you will define your own future and it won't be defined by the stars themselves. I only bring this up because that conversation is going on. That conversation between the two things that is brought up almost in a caricature here, right? This story, a caricature based on other folktales written maybe just a half a century beforehand, and probably around for a long time, of the fact that the gods do come down and visit and do good things for people. So anyway, all that in the background. By the way, there are people that still believe today that Elijah the prophet in Jewish circles comes down and helps out in a certain situation. They'll swear by, that person who appeared on the scene to do something good. We never found out who he was afterwards. That's Elijah the prophet. You'll still hear those things today in certain Jewish circles.
By the way, if I can add something, if you're coming out of Tel Aviv airport or somewhere in Israel, they sell mud, Israeli mud you can buy for, people buy it and put it on the, it seems to, I don't know. Have you ever seen that, Rabbi?
Sure, but I think that has more to do with cosmetology.
Cosmetics.
Cosmetics, yeah. But there's something even better than that, Ajit. Now, I don't know if you can still find it. There was a time, it was probably in the 90s or the early aughts, that at the airport, you could, at the Stuymaskis, the same stores you could get, duty free, there was a can. Anybody ever see this? And in the can was air, the air of the land of Israel. And the product was called, Sid, you'll love this, it was called Luftgeschäft. Luftgeschäft in Yiddish means, it's an idiom for, it's a scam, right? It's an idiom, but it literally means the business of air. So this company put together these cans that and people were buying it. I wish I had bought one. I so wish I had bought one just to have one, a sealed can of air from Israel. Okay. But people do look at, I have a close friend here who asked me to bring some stones from the land of Israel. In cemeteries, all Jewish cemeteries in the United States, you can find, they'll give you stones from the land of Israel to put on the grave or to put in with the casket when you were burying the coffin, the casket. So yeah, those things still live on strongly in different ways.
Well, and of course, the water from the Jordan for baptisms
Sure, yeah.
is a big deal.
Yeah. Okay. Well, anyway, a fascinating paragraph, I would say, this whole little story here. And then at the end, and that it ends in such a way. And I hadn't thought, I was wondering what you said, Jim, that I was wondering about, they surround him. It didn't immediately click that he's drawing on their healing energy, I think is what you were saying, right? He needs them. So if even in the same story that's elevating Paul, and by the way, Barnabas gets kind of forgotten in this whole thing, right? But elevates Paul still, but still he needed the other apostles. He needed their strength, their energy, if you will, however we see it, mystical or physical. Or
That was my point.
yeah, excellent. Wow, this is great stuff. Anything else before we go on?
Just one thought about verse 15. Seems kind of pretty straightforward to me in a sense that Paul and Barnabas are sort of admonishing the folks for thinking that they are gods. And they're, what he's telling them is turn to the living God who made the heaven and the earth and the sea and all that is in them. That would be very, very well-known and kind of basic to the foundation of Judaism. Am I correct in thinking that? So that the folks would clearly understand that.
Yeah, although is he talking now to Jews or is he talking to pagans? My feeling was he was talking to pagans, but still, look at the whole story here. We're in this birthing process of a movement which comes to correct what the Hebrews tradition tried to do but didn't fully do, or didn't do a lot of, right? And that is to really emphasize the oneness of God and where the power in the universe belongs. It doesn't belong to all these other things. And ironically, perhaps a purer form of monotheism. The prophets speak out about this all the time. And from the groundswell of prophetic criticism, which fell in many cases on deaf ears, which eventually led to the destruction, not of the first, only the first temple, but the second temple as well, at least in the memory of the Jewish people. It says, well, okay, it didn't work that way. Maybe it'll work a different way. And so these episodes are on the way to that happening. And what I find here is that Paul and Barnabas, they use something which was a horrible mistake, right? Can you imagine how horrible they felt that they're being worshipped as gods, and that they used it for an educational opportunity. It was an educational moment. No, we have to tell you folks. So yes, that idea is not new. And I'm guessing it wasn't new in the pagan world either. I'm sure it was out there, not just in Judaism. This idea, I think monotheism had spread a little bit more in the world.
But when you read the Iliad or the Odyssey, you see how these gods do inhabit, people and further their will in the ordinary human events, and are always either undermining or nudging, putting an idea in someone's head. As you said, David, it kind of subjects them to the fate of the gods. And the gods don't really care that much. They just kind of, they pick their favorites. They're kind of whimsical. They come and go. It's a real confusing kind of cosmological outlook. And this sharpens it and moves it into what I would say more human agency, more choice into the picture.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. So Eileen, would you like to read last paragraph?
Sure. The return to Antioch in Syria. After they had proclaimed the good news to that city and had made many disciples, they returned to Lystra and then on to Iconium and Antioch. There they strengthened the souls of the disciples and encouraged them to continue in the faith, saying, "It is through many persecutions that we must enter the kingdom of God." And after they had appointed elders for them in each church with prayer and fasting, they entrusted them to the Lord, in whom they had come to believe. Then they passed through Pisidia and came to Pamphylia. When they had spoken the word in Perga, they came down to Attalia. From there they sailed back to Antioch, where they had been commended to the grace of the God for the work that they had completed. When they arrived, they called the church together and related all that God had done for them and how he had opened a door of faith for the Gentiles. And they stayed there with the disciples for some time.
Okay, other than unpronounceable or difficult
Sorry.
place names, no, I have no idea either how to say. I'm wondering. I'm wondering a few. Well, before I wonder, it seems to me that one could sum up this stage of the way the narrative is unfolded until now in the Book of Acts as, in verse 22, it is through many persecutions that we may enter the kingdom of God. Which is not a happy philosophy. It's not a philosophy that I like. It reminds me of the rabbinic dictum is Chavivin Yisurin, that suffering is to be appreciated, because suffering brings you to check yourself out, to make sure to see how you're acting, to self-examination. It's a difficult philosophy, but it's there. It's one way of dealing with suffering, right? It's one way of justifying God's actions in this world. So that's to me that might sum up this kind of, this need for being stoned and almost dying. by the way, the other thing that I thought of course, is that the way to raise Paul was also to raise him from the dead, at least kind of, which seems like that, you know, that gives Paul a greater status as well, a more Jesus-like status. And then the other thing is, what I'm wondering about, this is a question though, in verse 25, what does it mean they had been commended to the grace of God for their work? Commended to the grace of what would that look like? What does that actually mean?
Question,
Any answers or
question.
comments?
Don't know.
At the least, it suggests that what they had already said, we're just mortals like you. And notice that right after that, David, they say, right after they had been commended to the grace of God, and I take that as kind of you've been blessed for this work, you've been anointed, and then they say at verse 27, they related all that God had done with them, and not claiming credit for themselves.
Right.
They're clearly retracing their steps. Eileen, you had a thought.
I was just going to say that back up in 19 and 20, Paul, they thought he was dead, but they took him out of the city. So the people really didn't see what the disciples had done. So they weren't witness to it. So in the mind's eye of the people, he was still elevated.
Hmm.
You know what I'm saying? It was just his circle that saw that did this, that raised him up. It wasn't the community didn't see this happen. I don't know. It just seems strange to me that it wasn't done in a public place.
Unless the purpose was to raise him in the eyes of the apostles. That was Ajit.
There is a different issue here where they talk about the first Council of Nicaea, and they brought the Council of Nicaea 325. They brought all the bishops together to have conversation and decide on Christian theology, etc. And when you try to figure out where these bishops came from, there is something here that says that Paul, when he was going from place to place and city to city, was appointing elders who evolved into bishops over time. So where it says on verse 23, and after they had appointed elders for them, it seems as if Paul and his group were appointing elders of each of the cities and towns where they had created a Christian community.
Yeah, that's a good comment, Ajit. And I think this is a snapshot of the origin of what came to be known as the church, right? And its structure that by the time of Nicaea in 325, the church was kind of part of the Roman Imperium at that point. But again, the pattern is interesting as they retrace their steps to the places they had been, and then appointing elders, encouraging them. This is kind of a primal glimpse into that emerging community, and back up, and you'll see how they came together. They go to the synagogue typically, and by that third Sabbath, they're being pushed out for probably a number of reasons, and yet there's a handful of both Jews and Gentiles and the God-fearers who go with Paul, and then they of course have talked to their friends, and so by that third Sabbath, it's like the God-fearers outnumber the local residents of the synagogue, and so suddenly the tradition, the order, it's all off balance. So Paul takes these new folks and they plant house churches, and these house churches in these communities become churches that Paul, we will notice in another few chapters, he then starts writing letters to them. And those are the letters we now have in the New Testament from Paul. But yeah, so it's kind of an interesting insight into this early emergence that led to that tragic split.
Terry, go ahead.
Yeah, I was struck by the word church this time because, as you just said, Steve, they met at the synagogue, but now it says they appointed elders for them in each church. And then in verse 27, when they arrived, they called the church together. So I was wondering, well, what did the word church, what did it actually mean? So I just looked up the original word church. Where did that come from? And it comes from the Greek word kairos, which means power, which is kind of interesting. And then it says it's akin to the Latin cavus, which means hollow or more like a cave. I'm thinking, well, that's kind of interesting that you have this idea of power from the Greek, which is probably what this would be related to, the people given the power, or maybe the power of the Holy Spirit, the power of Jesus, whatever kind of power they're talking about, but also with the persecutions, and they kind of had to hide. And they did use caves and catacombs and stuff like that and had to hide. So I'd never really thought about that.
Is the word hollow or hallow? Hallowed be thy name, say.
Hollow, Hollow, as in a hole or like a cave is what the dictionary says.
Terry, I'm not sure about that nuance or that aspect of it. I mean, church typically comes from that word ekklesia, right? Kaleo, to call out. It's the ones who have been called out into the koinonia, into the fellowship, into the community. And I think that word also in the Septuagint applied to synagogue gatherings as well as churches, but yeah, they become singular gatherings, mostly Jewish Christians, with the Gentiles now coming in more and more so, as we'll find out. But I'm presuming they continue to honor Shabbat. And then the first possible time, the first day of the week after Shabbat is Sunday. And that's when they probably start the Eucharist, remembering, do this in remembrance of me. And they reenact the Last Supper and have communion. So that's my take on how it became Sunday. It was just the first time they could after Shabbat.
Okay, well, yeah, please, Jim.
Well, just from sort of a literary point of view, this is not theological, but it strikes me as though the author went into some fairly great detail prior to this very last paragraph. And then he got to sort of the end, it's like, oh, geez, I only got so much room left on the page to wrap this all up. And so we get from Iconium to Antioch to Pisidia and Pamphylia and Italia. It's like not a whole lot of detail there, just big journey to kind of cover the whole rest of it in a short paragraph.
So two reactions to that, Jim. One is when one looks at genealogical lists or map lists and things in the Hebrew Bible, and they start to be really boring, and Book of Chronicles is like this as well. And then suddenly there'll be a slight change in that list, sometimes a larger change in that list. You understand that in general, there's so much to say, really only the things that the author or the editor wanted to make a point of get said, right? So not everything is to assume that everything was covered is right. That I think we need to get past that. The second thing is from modern biblical scholarship, you may notice that many, if you use commentaries, the Anchor Bible commentaries, the ICC, the New Testament library now. By the way, it just came in the mail yesterday. Not enough time. The Acts, an up-to-date critical commentary, as opposed to the older, not so up-to-date critical commentary I've been using. But you'll notice that very often that the ratio of the first, say, 2/3 or first 2/3 of the biblical book are this much of the commentary, and the last third is this much, which to me just means that the scholar was under a debt. They're always running late, right, on these things, like years late. And somebody says, you need to get this in, get it in. So maybe that's what happened here. So, the editor, Luke's editor said, enough already. I need the installment. Just give me get to the next part. I get. But I say that in jest. The first part, I think we're only told in detail the stories that matter for the ongoing trying to build up, in this case, build up Paul or build up the nascent church, what's happening. And then finally, I guess the word for church, we need to be, I think, careful, Terry and Jennifer, with our usages of synagogue and church, synagogue, and temple. I think we need to be really careful. Ajit began our conversation today about terms that get us into trouble, like liberal conservative. Well, a temple, right, is a migdash. A temple is a sacred space which is utilized in more ancient religions, or today in Buddhism and Hinduism and perhaps other non-monotheistic or non-Abrahamic traditions. That's a temple, right? But in the 19th century, some Jews in the Reform movement wanted to displace the notion that the temple in Jerusalem will be rebuilt. So they started to call their synagogues temples. Hence, you have the tradition in the Reform movement and in some conservative synagogues, usually not on the East Coast, that will call their synagogue temple so-and-so. So we need to be careful. And as far as a synagogue is concerned, in ancient times, synagoges is the place where people came together. And it was used not only for prayer and not only for the study of Torah, although those may have been the official use, but they were used for the meetings of the boulé of the community council. There was the only place where that was the most important communal structure, so to speak. And that's why those are the things that are left in archaeological digs, and those are the places. For instance, I just heard of a relatively new dig or new discoveries from Hakuk in northern Israel in the Galilee. This beautiful synagogue floor, which certainly was not just used for prayer. And then finally, the word church is really a word that in Hebrew would be kihila. Kihila would be community, a place of bringing together, or knesset. And so, I just to blur the boundaries, to blur the definitions. I think that would be my takeaway from today, is that we need to embrace the blurring of. Embrace the messiness, as one of my rabbinic colleagues said about a decade ago. Embrace the messiness of life.
So, Rabbi, at some point in the future, I would love to hear your views on this movement to build a third temple.
Okay, sometime in the future.
I'm very interested in seeing how you feel about that.
Okay, I'm sure you can guess, but we'll deal with that another time.
I may be in agreement with you on that, but on this here, I'm starting to sense something. Christian theology is based on the writings of Paul. It really is, from Romans, Ephesians, Galatians, the letters of Paul. And so to make the Christian theology viable, one has to make Paul viable. And I think this book of Acts is about making Paul an important, viable figure, so that Christian theology is important and viable. That's how I'm reading the book of Acts. Because if you take those 21 letters that come after Acts, there's 21 letters followed by Revelations. If you take those 21 letters, that's where most of Christian theology comes in: Romans, Galatians, Ephesians, and a couple of 1 Peter, 2 Peter. If that's not there, the Christians really don't have a theology, because there's nothing stated in the Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John that says this is what Christians believe. So this is making Paul an important figure here. That's what Acts is doing.
If
That's
Paul,
my personal view.
define
Nobody has to
theology-
agree with me on it.
if Paul hadn't created that theology, Christians would have created it anyway in some other form.
Yeah.
Okay,
Well,
that-
next week is a pivotal chapter, chapter 15. It's the first council, the Jerusalem Council. And that's where a lot of the theological direction of the church is agreed upon and set. So I'm looking forward to going through that with y'all next week.
By the way, I want to apologize. As a Baha'i, I'm neither Christian nor Jew. So I'm giving my views and they mean absolutely nothing here. So
That's why we need your voice, Ajit.
we need you to keep peace so we don't get it at each other, each other's throats. Yeah.
thank
Anyway,
goodness for Zoom.
I look forward to next week as well. It'll help me in my preparation for being in Jerusalem in just a few weeks. And we'll have more to talk about that later. Okay, so have a good weekend,
you.
everyone. Lovely to see you. Bye-bye. Thanks for being here.
Bye.